Howdy, it's Mr. Justice. We're going to talk about 2.1 Intro to Biodiversity. Let's get started. We're going to talk about biodiversity in terms of its importance to ecosystems. We'll talk about how we can organize biodiversity in three different levels. We'll talk about environmental stressors and population bottlenecks. We'll get into disruptions and how ecosystems that have a larger number of species are more likely to recover from them. We'll also get in briefly into specialist and generalist species, and we'll talk about species richness and evenness too. All right, so we've got a pretty complex food web here and a not so complex food web here. Right, take a look. In terms of species richness in these areas, the ecosystem on the left is more biodiverse in terms of its richness. There's a lot more species there as a result, right? Compare that to the number of species in the food web on the right. Hey, if we were to take out one of these individuals from this not so complex food web, this not very biodiverse food web like the sea snails, we might see a direct impact in the individuals above and below in this food web, right? For example, if we take out that sea snail, we might increase the seaweed because the sea snail was controlling the population of the seaweed before, right? So we'll see that increase there. We might, because we're removing the sea snail, it was being eaten by the crab. And so we might actually decrease the population numbers of the crab and the gull, which eat the crab. If we did that over here, like let's say that we removed the crab from this very complex, highly biodiverse ecosystem, we might not have that same crashing of those other populations as before, because there are other organisms in this very complex, very biodiverse food web that are able to fill that niche that was left behind by that crab, right? So that we might see an increase of these mollusks or these the starfish eating and consuming those producers, and those now that we're increasing those, we might not necessarily see a decrease in any of the other organisms that would have eaten that crab as a result. So yeah, the one on the left is more biodiverse, so it's healthier too. It can better respond to, well, a stress like removing an organism from a system, making that organism extinct, or even adding an organism in the case of an invasive species, better able to respond likely to it. So there's three levels of biodiversity here. We can talk about it in terms of ecosystem diversity and look at all of the different variety of ecosystems within this image here. We've got a desert with all of its plants and animals uniquely suited to live within it, just as we have a freshwater lake or river rather, and a marine ecosystem and an estuary where we have that combination of the salt and the fresh water where those meet. All of these areas here will be able to support a whole host of producers, which in turn will support those consumers above it, right? Likewise, the forest ecosystem is very different than what we might find on the beach or in the water. We can take any one of those ecosystems and then look at the species within it. We can look at the species richness, the number of species present, in addition to the proportions or its evenness, right? How well are the different species distributed relative to another? So we'll talk about that here too. And then finally, we'll discuss genetic diversity, right? Hey, the DNA, the genome of each of these individuals within any one of these ecosystems is going to be different, right? Different in terms of the mutations and the recombination events that happened in the parental gametes during meiosis, right? All of that seeks to or creates these opportunities of these individuals that have different DNA. Because they have different DNA, they have different traits, and those traits will allow them to either adapt to environmental stressors or not. The higher the biodiversity in the area, the higher the ecosystem health, right? Higher the ecosystem health. We've got 4 different ecosystems here. We can talk about it in terms of species, right? Hey, what's the species richness of the individuals within the wetlands? Well, in this picture, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So the species richness would be 4. All of these species have their own set of DNA. And so within the species, the differences in those DNA might give the individuals an increase of disease resistance. Or maybe the DNA is going to cause some of the frogs to be slightly larger than others. Maybe a slightly larger frog is better able to evade being captured by a predator, or maybe the fact that it's small is able to make it able to hide from predators, right? So those traits are all determined by DNA, and it will give them certain abilities, right? Hey, maybe some of those abilities are that it can withstand or tolerate an increase in pH or salt in the soil, or temperature within the ocean, right? Or not. And if it doesn't, that species will go extinct. So ecosystem diversity is referring to the number and variety of ecosystems or habitats within a specified area. And the higher the ecosystem diversity, the increase of overall biodiversity. Here in the Las Vegas Valley, we've got actually a pretty biodiverse area. If you really think about it, in the east side of town, we've got Lake Mead, and Lake Mead is a freshwater ecosystem with all the plants and animals that would live in it and along the banks. And just on the other side, right about 35, 45 miles or so, is a forest ecosystem, Mount Charleston, on the west side of town, right? And think of all of the different organisms uniquely adapted to live within the forest ecosystem. And then in between those two is the desert, right? We live in the Mojave Desert, and you're looking at these images here of the creosote bushes in the background. Those creosote bushes have a really unique adaptation that, because the soil is so poor in a desert, the adaptation allows them to deposit chemicals within the soil, which dissuades other plants from encroaching on their very limited nutrients that they're able to take up from the soil. But the point is that we've got these organisms that are uniquely adapted to live in each of these ecosystems. And the more biodiverse those ecosystems are, the more overall biodiverse the area is as a result. So now we can talk about the species within each of these ecosystems. We can we can count up and quantify, something called species richness. Now, in an area, right? Richness is referring to the total number of different species found in an ecosystem. The higher the richness, the higher the ecosystem health. You can just count them up, right? What's the unit? Species. 1, 2, 3, 4 species. The species richness is traditionally the easy one to grasp between richness and evenness. Students struggle a little bit more with this one. Evenness refers to the number of individuals and how well they're balanced within an ecosystem, right? If there's 1 or 2 dominant species, then the ecosystem's not very even. Compare that maybe to a population size that is more balanced, the ecosystem is even. Take a look at this example. We've got communities 1 and community 2. If you count up the species richness in both communities, let's do that right now. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. If you count them up, you determine the richness. So what's the species richness in both community 1 and 2 is 4. Now, this is one of the reasons why species richness is not, it's a good determiner of whether or not something is biodiverse, but it's only half an area is biodiverse. It's only half of the story, though, right? Even though communities 1 and 2 have the same species richness, they're actually highly uneven in terms of the proportions between each of those species, right? Take a look. There's that keyword balanced. Let's take a look at the balance of species between communities 1 and 2. Take a look, it's actually calculated down here for us. These proportions, 25% all across the board for each of these 4 species, is pretty even. As a result, we would say community 1 is highly even. Compare that to the distribution of the organisms within community 2, right? Hey, look, we're being dominated by 1 species. Think maybe an invasive species, right? 70% of all of the species is just one, this kind of lighter colored tree. All of the others are a lot less than what maybe normally it would be, right? So because of that, community 2, since it's not very balanced between the different species, since the proportions are out of balance, out of whack, unevenly distributed, you would say that community 2 has low evenness. Here's another example. Think to yourself, what's the species richness? You might want to push pause, think about it. If you're looking at this, you can count up the number of individuals, right? Let's do that again. Individual species. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in community 1. What's the species richness of community 1? 6. How about community 2? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Both communities 1 and 2 have a species richness of 6. And yet community 2 is more biodiverse. The reason why is because community 2 has a more even distribution of the organisms, the different species that live within that community, right? You can kind of just see it just by looking at it. On the left, we're being dominated by the elephants, and on the right, everyone is more or less evenly distributed amongst the different species. So because of that, community 2 is more biodiverse. Genetic diversity is really important to an ecosystem. The genetic diversity is a measure of the gene pool, the set of genes in an ecosystem, right? Within a population of a given species. That genetic diversity was determined by random mutations that come from the copying of DNA, in addition to the recombination of chromosomes during meiosis 1 of those gametes, those reproductive cells that an organism gets from its parents. That recombination event, along with random mutations and independent assortment and random mating, all of this is increasing the genetic diversity in an area. The more genetic diversity in an area, in a population, the better population can respond to environmental stressors like drought, disease, pests, or famine. The more genetic diversity leads to a higher chance that some of the population have traits that allow them to survive the environmental stressor. Take a look here. I've got a monoculture in the bottom, and I've got a polyculture in the top of this image right here, right? Hey, think about with monocultures all have one specific type of organism within it, right? One species of potato in this case. Hey, if blight comes through, if some pathogen comes through and impacts that one species, you might be in trouble later on because we've completely wiped out that one species. It's not very biodiverse, this monoculture. Hey, if we have a polyculture, a polyculture is one that has more than one type of crop within it, right? And that same blight comes through, we won't be impacted quite as much because the disease resistance or the other organisms were resistant to that disease that passed through that impacted all of the others. But notice that we're able to respond and bounce back from that environmental stressor disease because of that, because of the increase of genetic diversity. So if we can increase genetic diversity because of random mutations and recombination of DNA and random mating and independent assortment, we can decrease genetic diversity. And that can happen too. That can happen through a bottleneck event. A bottleneck event is some environmental disturbance, like maybe natural disaster or when humans come in and destroy habitats for development, urban, rural development. This environmental disturbance is drastically reducing the population size, and it kills off the organisms regardless of their genome. Now, think about what happens. You've got a large population, and much of it gets wiped out. So we've gone from a larger, stable distribution of genes to a much smaller one. And the distribution of the genes between the larger and the smaller population might not be the same composition. So the surviving population is smaller because as the individuals die, they randomly do it, and it doesn't necessarily represent the genetic diversity of the original population. Here's a pretty classic example, right? We've got 3 different types of individuals here, right, as represented by these different colored spheres. We've got yellow, we've got white, and we've got blue, and they live within this ecosystem with this bottle, right? So the bottleneck event kind of talks about, well, if we were to tip this over, if we were to kill off a lot of them through some natural disaster or human habitat destruction, think about it, not all of these spheres will be able to get into the new population, right? Not only that, take a look, right? Some of them will survive potentially, the vast majority of them will die off. And so take a look though, this is the point. Not only is the surviving population a lot smaller, the distribution of the traits is not the same as what it was before. You have to think to yourself, all of the traits within this original population are there as the result of a lot of evolution through a natural selection, right? So now all of a sudden a natural event happens and we kill off the vast majority of the population. We've actually got rid of most of the white spheres. So with it, their traits gone, right? What if that was the trait that made them more resistant to blight, for example, right? And notice that the yellow spheres didn't even make it into the surviving population at all. So their DNA and their genes have been wiped off from the face of this earth as a result. Kind of scary. The distribution of the DNA changes too. Yeah, bottleneck events are going to reduce genetic diversity. And why? This is because the population's smaller and it's less genetically diverse, making it even that much more vulnerable to environmental disturbances. Imagine for a moment with a surviving population, if blight came through here and was impacting blue, right? The blue spheres, that would be a problem for that population. It happened multiple times in the cheetah populations throughout the world. Scientists believe that there were two different historic bottleneck events that happened with cheetahs that reduced the genetic diversity between cheetahs. One was 100,000 years ago, and the other was 11,000 years ago. And scientists believe that that we're undergoing a third genetic bottleneck with cheetah survival, with all of the inbreeding that's happening here. Inbreeding is this process where individuals that are related to one another mate and produce offspring. The problem with that is that inbreeding is increasing those kind of the bad traits, or amplifying the bad traits that would have normally have been kind of masked by maybe a dominant trait in a wild type traditional population. Because they're being inbreeded, you're amplifying those, making that genetic diversity even that much more poor in the area. You guys are going to read about this article and answer some questions in a Canvas assignment. So take a look there. Ecosystem resilience is referring to the ability of an ecosystem to return to its original condition after some disturbance, like a fire, a windstorm, some clear-cutting event, or other events like habitat destruction, right? The ability of the ecosystem is to be resilient, to bounce back, is going to increase the more species diversity there is, right? Think again of that large food web. You take out one piece of it in a complex food web, you might not necessarily unravel, you'll impact it, sure, but you won't unravel the entire food web compared to a food web or an ecosystem that is less diverse that could be impacted by it. High species diversity means more plant species can repopulate disturbed ground. Their roots are anchoring in that nutrient-rich topsoil, providing that food in that habitat space for other animal species too, right? You're looking here at before and after of some ecosystem after an environmental disturbance, like an increase of nutrient-rich fertilizers in the area. What that did was it had an impact on increasing the algal blooms in the area, decreasing the dissolved oxygen, which decreases the plant life and the fish life all throughout, and can even impact areas on the shore too. All right, so ecological disruptions are going to impact specialist species first before it impacts generalists. Take a look. A specialist species like these koala bears or panda bears have a narrow niche. That means that they've got a very narrow tolerance for abiotic factors in the area, right? Let's say that they can't handle large swings or shifts in temperature changes or pH or salinity levels, right? Or in the case of the koala bear, there's a very specific set of resources that it needs, like the eucalyptus trees. right? The eucalyptus leaves that it eats. You take away the eucalyptus leaves from an area and you're going to decrease the koala bear because it's unable to eat and digest any other organism as a result, right? Think of the Australian wildfires that impacted the Australian bush. Decreasing the plant source that these guys eat is going to decrease the koala bears themselves. A opposite of a specialist is a generalist, like the raccoons or the mice or a bear. Generalists have a broader niche. They're able to withstand those shifts in temperature, pH, or salt levels. Hey, there's a broader diet too. So if the eucalyptus leaves go away, there's other sources that the individuals are able to consume. We're going to impact those specialist species first because they're more delicate, right? There's that narrower niche, then they're less likely to be able to survive and adapt, and more likely to go extinct versus the individuals that are able to be a little bit more adaptable. They're generalists after all. So this is the Practice FRQ 2.1 that I'd like you to include as part of your notes. And I'm hoping that this was helpful to you. Let me know if there's any questions.